How do you analyze a removal issue on a civil procedure essay? Well, step one, you have to understand what subject matter jurisdiction is. Primarily, how does a federal court obtain subject matter jurisdiction under federal question and diversity? If you don't know any of these concepts, no problem, pause the video here, go back, watch my videos on federal question and diversity, and then you can resume watching this video. But remember, in short, subject matter jurisdiction is merely a requirement that a civil court must meet in order to have the authority to hear and decide a case before it. Remember, I like to say there's 4 ways a federal court can obtain subject matter jurisdiction. Number 1, federal question jurisdiction. Number 2, diversity. Number 3, supplemental jurisdiction. And number 4, the subject of today's video, which is removal. So the big question is going to be, how does a federal court obtain subject matter jurisdiction under removal? Well, the good news about removal is if you understand how a federal question jurisdiction analysis and a diversity jurisdiction analysis work, then removal is going to be the easiest analysis ever for you. Removal allows the defendant to move a case from state court to federal court if the case could have been originally brought in federal court. So if the plaintiff is bringing a case that satisfies federal question or diversity in state court, then the defendant is going to be able to move that case from the state court to the federal court. There's one extra little caveat there for diversity jurisdiction, but let's look at federal question first. So imagine, this is typically how the scenario is going to play out. Imagine you have a plaintiff suing a defendant in state court. That's the worst drawing of a state court ever, but plaintiff is suing defendant in state court on a copyright infringement claim. So, copyright infringement claim. If you remember from federal question jurisdiction, what is the test? If the plaintiff alleges a complaint that arises under federal law, then the court is going to have subject matter jurisdiction under federal question jurisdiction. Now, of course, a copyright infringement claim, if it's pled on the face of the plaintiff's complaint, is going to satisfy federal question jurisdiction, which means a federal court is going to have subject matter jurisdiction under federal question jurisdiction. The problem in this scenario is the plaintiff isn't bringing the action in federal court. The plaintiff is bringing the action in state court. So what ends up happening here is, if the defendant wishes, the defendant can remove this case from state court. The defendant can remove it to federal court because the case could have been originally brought in federal court. It's a copyright infringement claim, arises under federal law, satisfies federal question jurisdiction. Plaintiff could have brought this in federal court. Plaintiff chose to file it in state court. Defendant can say, not so fast, my friend, and move the case to federal court. Very easy. On a civil procedure essay, it's a federal question jurisdiction analysis in terms of the defendant's perspective. It's the exact same test, nothing changes. You just plug in a federal question jurisdiction analysis. If it's satisfied, defendant can move the case from state court to federal court. Let's look at a diversity case really quick. Because there's one small nuance with diversity cases, but again, it's super easy. So let's say you have a plaintiff suing a defendant in state court. State court. That's always going to be the key, by the way. If you're looking for a removal jurisdiction, if you're looking for a removal issue, the way you're going to spot that is if the plaintiff is bringing a federal claim in state court. So this is always step one. Look to see if you have a state court involved. If it's a federal court, you're not dealing with a removal issue. So plaintiff is suing the defendant. Let's say that it's a breach of contract claim. Breach of contract. And let's say it's for $100,000. Plaintiff is seeking $100,000 in damages, so the amount in controversy equals $100,000. let's say that plaintiff is a citizen of the state of New York, and let's say that defendant is a citizen of the state of Texas, and let's say that this action is being brought in a New York state court. Okay, how does this play out? Well, we know that breach of contract is a pure state law action, so federal question jurisdiction is out. This does not satisfy federal question. Let's think about diversity jurisdiction. Well, do we have complete diversity? Every citizenship on the plaintiff side of the case is different than every citizenship on the defendant side of the case. Plaintiff is a citizen of New York, defendant is a citizen of the state of Texas. We have complete diversity. The amount in controversy exceeds $75,000, so the court would have diversity jurisdiction over this claim. But the problem, again, is this is being brought in a New York state court. This isn't being brought in federal court. So we don't care about diversity jurisdiction unless the defendant wants to move the case. Defendant says, hey, you know what? This case was brought in state court. I'd rather have it in federal court. I'm from Texas. You're from New York. I don't like this case being brought in New York state court. That's unfair to me. I'm a Texas citizen. I don't want you having home court advantage in New York. You know what, plaintiff? I'm going to remove this case from New York state court to federal court. And the defendant in this scenario would be fully within his right to do that. This case could have been originally brought in federal court. Defendant can move it to federal court, from state court to federal court. Now here's the one caveat that you have to look out for. Imagine that this case had been brought in Texas state court. Imagine that the plaintiff had sued in Texas state court. In this scenario, under the rules of federal civil procedure, the defendant couldn't remove this case, even though this satisfies diversity jurisdiction. The federal court would have subject matter jurisdiction over this case under diversity jurisdiction, but because the plaintiff is bringing the action in the defendant's home state of Texas, the defendant is not allowed to remove it to federal court. And really, why would the defendant want to remove it? And that's kind of the idea behind this. But there's just a third rule if you're dealing with removal in diversity cases, that the defendant cannot remove the action if the action is brought in any state in which the citizen that the defendant is a citizen of. So if you had multiple defendants, if you had defendants in New York and Texas and California and whatever, then if the action was brought in any of those states, the defendant couldn't remove it. So it counts for all of the defendants you have. So if I added multiple defendants here, you know, defendant 2 is from New York, defendant 3 is from California. If the case was brought in any of these states, the defendant couldn't move it from those state courts to federal court. That's just how it works. You can remember this pretty easily, though, by thinking about it as the defendant's home state. Why would a defendant want to remove a case from their home court? If you're in Texas, if you're a citizen of Texas, and the case is being brought in the state of Texas, you're happy about that. This plaintiff from New York is going to have to come down to your state and litigate under your home court advantage. So you don't have any need to remove that to federal court. You're happy with the situation. So think about it in terms like that. Just remember, in a diversity jurisdiction case, if you're dealing with a removal issue, the defendant is not going to be able to remove the case from state court to federal court if the defendant is a citizen in the state in which the action is brought. That's all you need to know for removal, guys. It's basically every issue. Again, it's super easy. You just plug in a federal question jurisdiction analysis or a diversity jurisdiction analysis. If those are satisfied, then the defendant is going to be able to remove the case from state court to federal court. If you're dealing with diversity, remember there's just that one extra requirement that the defendant cannot be a citizen in the state in which the action is brought. But with that, guys, I'll leave you to it, and I'll see you at our next video.